So, hello everybody, this is Bante Joe here, and I'm just here at Endagala in the forest, and thought to record a short Dhamma discussion for the internet. So I thought that maybe we could start with just a little bit of meditation, so can lean forward a bit and arch the spine, and look about 3 feet in front, and close our eyes. And can focus in on the breath. Can know when it's coming in, and know when it's going out. If we breathe in a long breath, can just know I'm breathing in a long breath. And if we breathe in a short breath, can just know I'm breathing in a short breath. And can focus in on the breath at the tip of the nose. And when watching the breath at the tip of the nose, one can try to make mindfulness as continuous as possible, being aware all the way through the in-breath. As the in-breath turns to the out-breath, all the way through the out-breath, and as the out-breath turns back to the in-breath again. Trying to keep mindfulness as continuous as possible. And before we finish meditating, can spread thoughts of goodwill, wishing may all beings all around everywhere be happy and at ease. May they put in place the causes necessary to be happy and at ease. And we can make the mind infinite. Can make it unbounded. All the way to the ends of the universe and beyond. In every dimension. May all beings all around everywhere be happy and at ease. Okay, and can open our eyes and do a short Ovada for the internet. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. So hope that everybody is having a great day wherever it might be. And this is just the end of the rainy season here in Sri Lanka. And the wevas are getting full, the reservoirs are getting full, which is nice to see. And so a friend from Canada, Marcelo, had asked him if he had any Dhamma questions. And one question he said is that there's a massive mental health crisis across Canada and maybe the world because of social isolation and rising death tolls, and maybe, I can't remember if we mentioned uncertainty about the future, these kind of things related to the current virus pandemic, and asked if, he said, do you have any advice on that? And so the Buddha's teachings actually give a lot of tools to deal with isolation and uncertainty. These are the kind of things that are the hallmarks, not all of them, but that kind of uncertainty, this kind of impermanence of things is one of the hallmarks of what makes things suffering, what makes the things that one loves into suffering. So to deal with these things, some of the techniques are things that one might kind of gel with. They might seem like something not intuitive, but something that goes along with the way that seems pleasant, seems nice. And some of them go against the grain. There's kind of these two approaches. Those ones that go against the grain can seem less pleasant to do, less nice. But both these approaches come as highly recommended by the Buddha. And he doesn't really describe kind of a Noble Eightfold Path without both of them. It's kind of one of these approaches is what they call more or less kind of a Sukha-Patipada approach. And this comes from making the mind calm, making the mind at ease, trying to bring it into, trying to bring the mind to a place of concentration. The other approach is what they call Dukkha-Patipada. And it's kind of, usually it's described, these two approaches are described in terms of the overall path that people have to take. But they're both basically elements, and kind of sometimes referred to as samatha vipassana. This is the more common way to refer to them. And this Dukkha-Patipada approach basically involves using discernment, using kind of reason to try to overcome one's attachments to things. So with regards to a situation like a pandemic, one of the things that often comes up or can come up in a person's mind is kind of how, wondering how long this pandemic will last, and kind of what will the consequences be. Maybe what if I get the virus? What if one of my friends or relatives gets the virus? What about my job? What about, all these things that are affected by the virus, kind of by people not being able to go to work, people not being able to see one another. And then there's also the difficulties that come from staying alone. If one is isolated, then these kind of thoughts can become like a feedback loop. They can become like a, kind of something that kind of grows and grows and grows and grows the more one thinks about them. So to help with that, the Buddha's recommendation is to try to bring the mind to a place of calm. It's one of his recommendations. So the escape, one of the escapes from what they call, this is one of the, they call the hindrances that stop the mind from going into states of peace, is this hindrance of restlessness and remorse. This kind of hindrance of restlessness and remorse, also called like a restlessness, kind of like, and remorse, also kind of anxiety. It's kind of this kind of thing that comes from thinking about things in a kind of way that's not skillful, in a way that's not in line with the Four Noble Truths. So the way that one thinks about those things is that when one encounters something that one loves, one thinks about how great it is, one thinks about how nice things are, and one projects into the future on the basis of how good that might be. And kind of when thinking about how much one likes these things, this is the category. And one thinks that one wants to have them more. So then when they change, one experiences a lot of fear. And that projection can go into the future. Like, when will this end? This will go on for so long. This is going to happen. That's going to happen. And this kind of, both of these things can be an aspect of this udacha kukucha, this kind of thinking, and kind of this restlessness that the mind isn't calm, it can't stay focused on one object. So the escape from this kind of anxiety, the escape from this kind of worry, is a kind of a breath meditation. This is the topic that the Buddha gives for cutting off discursive thinking. When one is having anxiety problems, panic problems, problems of worry about the future, then this is an aspect of discursive thinking that's gone into a realm that's unskillful, that's unsuitable. So to cut that off, what one wants to do is learn to focus on the breath in various ways so that the mind doesn't rush away from the breath. One wants to learn to breathe. One can learn to breathe in such a way that the body calms down. And when the body calms down, sometimes those thoughts will calm down too. So one learns to anchor one's mind to this topic of breath meditation. And in anchoring one's mind to this topic of breath meditation, one decouples it somewhat from this outside world, this world of kind of getting things that one likes and then having them change. Essentially what can happen is one couples one's mind to something one likes, and it stays attached to that. And then when it changes, something threatens it, one gets worried. So one can decouple that and instead couple the mind to the breath. They call it yoke, kind of yoga. Yoke the mind to the breath so that the mind stays with the breath all the time. And then one tries to make that into what they call one's satipatthana, one's foundation of mindfulness, one's basis of mindfulness, kind of learning to always keep the breath in mind. And kind of one goes throughout the day. One can use a mantra like Buddho, saying Bud on the in-breath, Do on the out-breath. And anytime one's thinking, basically, thinking about almost anything except what one needs to do. And if one needs to think about what one needs to do, that's one thing. But much of the thinking that goes on during the day is actually not necessary. One is kind of eating some food and one's thinking already about 20 years in the future, 30 years in the future. One is thinking about next year, one's thinking about bank accounts, one's thinking about kids, one's thinking about all these things. But really, what's going on right then is eating food. So if one learns to bring one's mind to just doing that, just eating food, and not letting the mind proliferate, not letting the mind go into papancha, expanding from whatever small worry, from whatever small thought there might be, to make this whole future that hasn't happened yet. This is the type of training that one basically has to train in. It's kind of very difficult to do because one gets pleasure, one gets happiness from yoking one's mind to these things outside that make one happy when one has them, but what make one worry when one doesn't have them. So the nice thing is that if one can do this, if one makes this one's satipatthana, if one makes this one's basis, then one, over time, the Buddha's description is that one learns to think what one wants to think, doesn't think what one doesn't want to think. And also one can practice in such a way that one has these feelings of bliss, feelings of ease arise in the mind. And this also solves the problem with being alone. Because when one is alone, if one's thoughts spin out of control, that gets really dangerous. So the Buddha actually says that the woods steal the mind of a monk who doesn't gain concentration. So one can use this method of breath meditation to try to anchor the mind to one object, to try to have it cut off discursive thinking, and to try to bring it to states of calm, to states of peace, to states of happiness. And in doing so, one gains a kind of refuge from these external changes in the world. One learns to decouple, de-yoke one's mind from them. So this is what we might call the kind of sukha patipada, or easy way, the way that sounds appealing, the way that sounds kind of, that might sound nice, it's very peaceful. The second way is what you might call the dukkha patipada, or is kind of more unpleasant to do. But this is also very necessary, and without developing insights in this direction, in the direction of what they call vipassana, or these kind of perception meditations, then one can't permanently end one's worries. The kind of bringing one's mind to calm can end them temporarily, but they'll return. So one wants to basically learn to see the truth of these things. And this means, regarding coronavirus, oftentimes when one thinks about coronavirus, one thinks about it in terms of, this is an anomaly, when will it go away, and things get back to normal. Maybe 1 year, 2 years, things will come back to normal. But when one looks at human history, actually, maybe the last 40, 50 years, or after World War II, at least, there's the Cold War, there's always been wars, but it's basically been a time in human history that's been, very peaceful relative to other times, very prosperous relative to other times, and very rich in technology and physical comforts relative to other times. So actually, when one looks at human history, this kind of uncertainty, this kind of danger to life is nothing unusual. This kind of coronavirus is actually, this is a part of being a human, and kind of that the bodies that humans have are subject to sickness, and there's no escaping it. There's only so much one can do to alleviate sickness. One can do a certain amount, but eventually the body just gets old. Or in some cases, even when people are young, they succumb to sickness. They're not able to fend off sickness. So one can learn to reflect on this coronavirus not as something that's an anomaly, not as something that's unusual, also not like the world is all the time in a pandemic state, not like the world is all the time in a state of sickness, but one can broaden one's perception to learn to see the world not just in terms of being a kind of pleasant slope where there's these rare blips, but that these unpleasant things are actually inescapable aspects of the things that we find pleasant. So one learns to bring the reflection to mind. I'm subject to sickness, and kind of reflects on death. My life is uncertain, my death is certain. There's so many ways I could die. I could get hit by a car, coronavirus could happen 2-3 years ago. One wouldn't have really thought too much about a pandemic. And bringing this perception into mind, what one learns to do is to detach one's mind from the world. It can create a sense of dispassion towards the world. What usually happens with people, or what can usually happen with people with the way that the way that one's mind can work, is that when things are good, one doesn't want to think about these things at all. Then when things get bad, one wants to find an escape from them as soon as possible. And then when things go to normal again, or go back to the way that one liked, then one forgets that what happened that was bad. It's kind of as if it might have been a blip. But one learns to see the kind of totality, that there's no life without death, there's no birth without aging, there's no health without sickness. All these things are interlinked. They're both together. There's no loving somebody, having somebody really dear to somebody without loss and separation. And it's kind of the inevitable result of health is unhealth. The inevitable result of somebody who's born is that they die. The inevitable result of somebody who being young is that they grow old. This is the kind of way that conditions work in the world. There's no stopping these things permanently in terms of making things totally permanent all the time. There is, even the universe itself gets finished off after a certain period of time. At least for the human realm. There's maybe some devas who stay kind of in a youngish state for quite a long time until the universe goes, but in any event, we'll keep our discussion to the human realm. So the thing about this dukkha patipada is that one learns to practice this not just during the time of coronavirus, but when coronavirus finishes, when things go back to normal, one casts one's mind back. Look, there was this coronavirus. I shouldn't get complacent. I shouldn't put all my weight on external sensual things. I shouldn't put my weight on my job. I shouldn't put my weight on my family. I shouldn't put my weight on my career. I shouldn't put my weight on physical beauty. I shouldn't put my weight on my status. All these things could be swept away in another 2 years, another 5 years, another 1 year. I don't know when they're going to end. Something like coronavirus could arise. When one learns to contemplate this way, when things are good, this is what helps to prepare one's mind. This is what helps to detach one's mind when things are bad, if one does it skillfully, not contemplating in a pessimistic way like, oh, it doesn't matter, but contemplating with a purpose in mind, that purpose being to find a refuge that doesn't depend on these things. That purpose being to de-yoke, to decouple one's mind from attachment to one's job, one's family, one's health, even one's life. These are the things, is attachment to these things that causes one to suffer in times like coronavirus, causes one to suffer in times like of war, causes one to suffer in old age. There's a story from the canon where a monk is approached by bandits and they're ready to kill him, and they start to threaten him, and his face grows even more clear. He says, they threaten to kill him, and the bandit leader asks, why aren't you afraid of death that everybody's afraid of? And he basically says that death would be he's not afraid of it because he won't. Basically, he's going to, not going to, but it would be a release for him from the 5 aggregates. He was an arahant, so he'd found something beyond death. So he no longer had to fear being born, getting old. Even the loss of his life was something he wasn't afraid of. So the bandits ended up being really inspired and ordaining. But in any event, it's the attachment to these things. It's the attachment to one's career, one's health. It's the attachment to these things that causes one to suffer when they're threatened, when they're looking like they're going to change. So this second method, this method of dukkha patipada, involves cultivating these perceptions right now during the time of coronavirus. All these things are not mine, cultivating not self. These things are not mine, they don't belong to me. Cultivating the perception of impermanence, these things are subject to ending. Cultivating the perception of death, that I'm going to die one day, and doing this in a skillful way so that one's mind doesn't become depressed, but that it leads one to search for a refuge that doesn't depend on these things. And then doing that not only during times of coronavirus when one really feels like one needs a refuge, but also keeping one's distance, remembering it, remembering the time of coronavirus when coronavirus ends, so that one doesn't once again get swept away. One doesn't once again link and yoke one's mind 100% to these things that, again, sometime in the future are going to become shaky, are going to cause one to suffer again. And if one practices in these ways, one practices this method of samatha, one practices this method of vipassana, then the eventual goal is to break these fetters. And the Buddha's teaching is that it's possible to break these fetters permanently. It's possible to put a permanent end to them, and in successively breaking them, one successively and permanently breaks one's attachments and breaks one's suffering, until the day comes when it might be possible for one to break all of them. And then even if bandits were to approach one, even if one's life was threatened by coronavirus, even if one's life was threatened by war, then one's mind would be at ease, irrespective. And that's the goal that one searches for in Buddhism.